My daughter's text shattered me. Mom, Brian thinks you don't fit in with his family. It's awkward when you're around. Don't come to the wedding. Too blue collar. Family only. After I'd paid $45,000 for her dream day. S. Oh, I called the resort and canceled everything. They got married at a courthouse. But that was only the beginning. The text came in at 9:42 p.m. I was standing at my kitchen counter, holding a deposit receipt from Seabreeze Resort. Mom, Brian thinks you don't really fit in with his family. It's awkward when you're around. Please don't come to the wedding. It's family only. I read it twice. Then I noticed the second message. To blue collar. The receipt in my hand was dated 3 days earlier. $45,000 wired at 10:17 a.m. full payment. Non-refundable after midnight that night. I set the paper down beside my cold coffee. I opened our last email thread with the event coordinator. Final guest count confirmed. Catering locked. Oceanfront ceremony, private ballroom, open bar. I checked my bank app. The transfer had cleared. At 9:47 p.m., I called my daughter. It went to voicemail. At 9:49, I called the resort's after-hours line. A recording said cancellations must be submitted before 11 p.m. local time to avoid forfeiture. I looked at the timestamp again. 9:50. I asked the operator to pull up my contract. She verified my name, the wedding date, and the suite reservations under Brian's parents' names. Are you the primary payer? She asked. Yes. There was a pause. Then you're the only one authorized to make changes. I asked her what changes included. Changes include cancellation, she said. Full cancellation before 11 p.m. avoids penalty. I asked her to email me the cancellation clause. At 9:53 p.m., the document arrived. Page 3, Section 8.2. Primary payer holds full authority prior to deadline. I read it once. At 9:55, I said, cancel the event. She asked if I was sure. I said yes. She placed me on hold. Soft, instrumental music played. I watched the microwave clock tick from 9:56 to 9:58. She returned. The venue, catering, and reserve suites are now released. I asked for written confirmation. It will be sent within 10 minutes. At 10:04 p.m., the confirmation email arrived. Subject line, event status, voided. I forwarded it to myself. Then I printed it. The printer ran longer than usual, 3 pages. I placed them on the counter beside the original receipt. At 10:12, my phone buzzed. My daughter, Mom, why did the coordinator just call me? I didn't answer. At 10:14, another message. Brian's parents are freaking out. At 10:16, she called again. I let it ring. I opened my banking app. The pending refund showed as processing. Estimated return, 3 to 5 business days. At 10:22, a new text. You can't just do this. I typed one sentence. I was the only authorized signer. I didn't add anything else. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. At 10:31, she sent, you embarrassed us. I set the phone face down. The coffee beside me had gone cold. I took one sip anyway. At 10:44, an unfamiliar number called. I answered, this is Daniel from Seabreeze Accounting. The man said, we need verbal confirmation that you initiated cancellation willingly. I did. Was there a dispute with another party? No. Understood. Refund will process Monday. The call lasted 2 minutes. At 11:02, my daughter sent a final message for the night. Brian says this proves his point. I didn't respond. The next morning, at 6:18 a.m., I woke up to 3 missed calls from her. At 6:21, a text from Brian's mother. I hope you reconsider this childish decision. I read it while sitting at the kitchen table. The sunlight was coming through the blinds in narrow strips. At 6:29, my daughter sent, we'll figure something else out. No apology. At 7:03, I checked my email again. Another message from the resort. All vendor contracts have been notified. Florist, photographer, live band. At 7:10, I logged into my shared planning spreadsheet. Access denied. I refreshed. Still denied. At 7:14, I tried the bridal planning portal. My login no longer worked. I closed the laptop. At 7:20, my daughter called. I answered. "What were you thinking?" she asked. "You told me not to come." "That's not what I meant. You said family only." Silence. "You know how Brian's family is," she said. I didn't respond. "They just don't understand. Our background. Our background paid for your wedding." She exhaled sharply. "You didn't have to humiliate us." I followed the contract. Another pause. "Brian's dad already put deposits down for a backup venue," she said. "He says they'll handle it." "That's good. You're not coming, right?" I looked at the printed confirmation on the counter. "You told me not to." She didn't argue. The call ended at 7:27 a.m. At 8:02, a new group message appeared. "Brian, his parents, my daughter. Brian, since the original venue was canceled, will proceed with a private ceremony. His mother, small and tasteful. No one asked me anything." At 8:15, I muted the thread. I opened my banking app again. The refund status remained pending. At 9:03, I received a voicemail from the florist. "We were surprised. Is everything okay?" I didn't call back. At 9:40, I placed the printed documents into a folder. I labeled it with the wedding date. At 10:12, my daughter sent a single message. "We're getting married at the courthouse next week." I read it once. At 10:14, she added, "You don't need to come." I set the phone down beside the folder. At 11:02, the resort sent a final invoice summary showing a zero balance. I printed that too. By noon, the kitchen was quiet again. The only sound was the refrigerator humming. At 1:18 p.m., I received a notification from my bank. Refund posted. $45,000 returned. I stared at the number for a full minute. At 1:23, my daughter sent a photo of a courthouse appointment confirmation. No caption. I didn't reply. At 2:05, Brian's mother emailed. "We trust you'll respect their wishes and keep distance." I archived it. At 3:11, I removed myself from the shared wedding album online. At 4:32, I received a calendar notification. Wedding date removed. I closed the laptop. That evening, at 7 p.m., I made dinner for one. The chair across from me stayed empty. At 8:14, my daughter sent one last message. "I hope you're happy." I didn't answer. The printer tray still held extra paper from the morning. I put it back into the cabinet. 3 days later, at 8:07 a.m., my daughter sent a courthouse photo. She and Brian stood in front of a beige wall. Two witnesses behind them. No caption. I didn't respond. At 8:15, Brian's mother posted the same photo on social media. Small, intimate, exactly how we wanted it. I read it once. Then I closed the app. At 9:02, my daughter sent, "We kept it simple, less pressure." I replied. At 9:11, "I hope it was what you wanted." She didn't answer. At 10:34, an email arrived from Seabreeze Accounting confirming full vendor release. Attached were cancellation timestamps. 9:55 p.m. logged. 9:58 finalized. I printed the page showing the authorization note. Primary payer verified. The printer hummed for 15 seconds. I placed the paper into the folder. At 11:20, I received a call from the photographer. "We had already blocked the weekend," she said. "Brian's father asked if we could rebook for a private session. We declined." I thanked her. At 12:02 p.m., my daughter texted, "Brian's dad is upset about the florist cancellation fee." "There was no fee," I replied. "He says vendors talk." I sent her a screenshot of the invoice summary showing $0 balance. No reply. At 2:17 p.m., Brian texted me directly for the first time in weeks. "You acted impulsively." I read the message twice. At 2:24, I responded. "I followed the contract terms." At 2:29, he replied, "You embarrassed my family." At 2:35, I typed, "You asked me not to attend." There was no response after that. At 3:10, I opened my email archive. I searched wedding deposit. 23 emails appeared. Most were from me confirming payments. At 3:22, I noticed one thread from 2 months earlier. Subject, guest list adjustments. Brian's mother had written, "We may need to reduce certain invites to keep the tone appropriate." My daughter replied, "Mom understands." I read the timestamp, 11:14 p.m. I didn't remember seeing that thread before. At 3:31, I checked the forwarding line. The message had been forwarded to my daughter privately, not to me. At 4:05, I closed the laptop. The house was quiet except for the dishwasher running. At 6:40 p.m., my daughter called. "I didn't know they'd say it like that," she said. "Like what?" "The blue-collar thing. You sent it." I was repeating what Brian said. "I waited. They just don't want tension at family events." "By removing me?" Silence. "At least you got your money back," she said. "That wasn't the point." "What was?" I didn't answer. The call ended at 6:52 p.m. At 7:03, a group text from Brian's parents. "We hope this doesn't affect future holidays." No one included me directly. At 7:10, I muted the thread again. The next morning at 8:14 a.m., my daughter sent an expense screenshot. Courthouse license, $85. Witness fee, $50. See, we kept it minimal. I read it and set the phone down. At 9:20, I logged into my online bank statements. The $45,000 refund showed fully cleared. I downloaded the transaction history and saved it as a PDF. At 10:45, I received an email from Brian's father. Subject, clarification. He wrote, "We would have preferred to reimburse you privately rather than public cancellation." I read that sentence twice. There had been no reimbursement offer. At 11:02, I replied. The cancellation followed the contract timeline. I attached the authorization clause. He did not respond. At 12:18 p.m., my daughter texted, "Brian says you're making this bigger than it needed to be." I didn't reply. At 1:05, I opened the original venue contract again. Section 5 listed suite allocations. 3 were under Brian's parents' names. Paid by me. I highlighted that section. At 1:40, I remembered something small. 2 weeks earlier, I had asked my daughter about rehearsal dinner seating. She said, "Brian's family will sit near the front." I asked where I would sit. She said, "We'll figure it out." I closed the document. At 3:12 p.m., my daughter called again. "We're planning a small dinner next month," she said. "For who?" "Just immediate family." I waited. "You can come if you want," she added. "If I want. It might be awkward." I didn't respond. At 3:18, she said, "Brian feels judged around you. I haven't spoken to him in months. He says you look at him like you don't approve." I looked at the folder on the table. I paid for his wedding. That's not the point. The call ended at 3:24 p.m. At 4:50, I checked my email again. A message from the resort survey department. "How satisfied were you with your cancellation experience?" I deleted it. At 6:02 p.m., I reheated leftover soup. The microwave beeped loudly in the empty kitchen. At 6:14, my daughter sent one more message. "Brian's family thinks this is proof we should have handled everything ourselves." I typed slowly. "You told me not to come." She didn't respond. At 8:09 p.m., I removed the wedding date reminder from my wall calendar. The square looked blank. At 9:30, I placed the folder into a filing cabinet. I labeled the tab simply, "Wedding Void." 2 weeks after the courthouse ceremony, at 7:18 a.m., I received an email from Brian's father. Subject, financial resolution. I opened it while standing at the kitchen counter. "We believe it would be appropriate for you to return the refunded amount to support the newlyweds." It read. The cancellation created unnecessary complications. I read it twice. At 7:22, a second email arrived. Attached, an invoice from a private banquet hall. $18,400. Deposit already paid by his family. I checked the timestamp. 6:59 a.m. At 7:30, my daughter texted, "Dad, can we talk about the money?" I didn't respond immediately. At 7:42, she called. "It's not about the full amount," she said. "Just something to smooth things over." How much? Maybe half. Half of what? The refund. I set the phone on speaker and opened my banking app. The $45,000 sat untouched. You asked me not to attend. I said, that doesn't mean you pull everything. I followed the contract. You didn't even warn us. You sent the text at 9:42. She was quiet for a moment. Brian's parents feel like you sabotaged us. I paid for your wedding. That's not the issue. What is? They think you canceled it to make a point. I looked at the folder in the filing cabinet. I canceled it because you removed me at 7:51. She said, they think you're holding money over us. I haven't asked for anything. They feel embarrassed. I wasn't invited. The call ended at 7:55 a.m. At 8:10, Brian texted directly. We're trying to move forward. Your refusal to help is creating division. I read the message twice. At 8:14, I responded. I paid once. At 8:17, he replied, that payment came with conditions. I opened our old email thread. No conditions were written. At 8:22, I replied, show me the condition. No response. At 9:05, Brian's father sent another email. If funds are not transferred by Friday, we will consider other measures. I read the sentence slowly. Other measures. At 9:11, I saved the email as a PDF. At 9:18, I printed it. The printer jammed halfway through. I cleared the paper slowly and restarted the print. At 9:27, I placed the page into the folder. At 10:02, my daughter called again. Can we just compromise? Compromise what? Give them something. They feel like you humiliated them publicly. I followed the cancellation window. They think you did it to prove a point. I did it because you told me not to come. She didn't respond. At 10:14, she said, Brian's dad says legally the funds were intended for the wedding. Legally? That's what he said. Was there a written agreement? No. Then legally, I followed the contract. She exhaled sharply. You're making this worse. At 9:42 p.m., you told me not to come. Silence. At 10:20, the call ended. At 11:03, I received a notification from my bank. Incoming message from Brian's father requesting wiring instructions for reimbursement processing. I opened the message. It read, please confirm your routing details so we may reconcile the event funds properly. I didn't reply. At 11:22, I searched my email for any written repayment agreement. There was none. At 12:05 p.m., my daughter sent a screenshot of a group chat. Brian's mother wrote, we tried to include her, but pride got in the way. The timestamp showed 8:03 a.m. At 12:14, I zoomed in on the screenshot. My name had been cropped out of the contact list. At 1:02 p.m., I called the resort accounting office. Can you confirm that as primary payer I retained cancellation authority? I asked. Yes, the woman said. The contract is clear. Is there any clause requiring repayment to other parties? No. The call lasted under 2 minutes. At 1:15, I wrote down her name. At 2:08, Brian texted again. If you don't contribute, we'll explain your behavior to extended family. I read it twice. At 2:12, I responded. You already have. No answer. At 3:30 p.m., my daughter called once more. Brian says you're threatening us. I haven't threatened anyone. He says withholding the money is manipulation. I refunded my own payment. You're twisting it. I followed the timeline. She paused. At least send something symbolic. I didn't answer. At 3:38, she said quietly, he's talking to a lawyer. I looked at the folder again. For what? He says the funds were promised. In writing, silence. At 9:42 p.m., you told me not to come. She ended the call. At 4:12 p.m., I opened my laptop. I created a new folder titled Correspondence. I saved every email from that week. At 4:28, I exported our entire text conversation. At 5:03, I printed the 9:42 p.m. message. The paper felt thin in my hand. At 6:40, the house was quiet again. At 7:02, my daughter sent one last message for the day. Brian feels betrayed. I set the phone down beside the folder. 3 days later, at 8:06 a.m., an email arrived from a law firm I didn't recognize. Subject: Notice of Intent. I opened it while sitting at the kitchen table. My coffee had already gone cold. The letter stated that funds earmarked for the marital event were withdrawn in bad faith, causing reputational harm and financial disruption. It requested voluntary reimbursement within 10 business days. I read the signature line: Attorney representing Brian's father. At 8:12 a.m., I saved the letter as a PDF. At 8:16, I printed it. The printer hummed steadily this time. At 8:24, I called the number listed in the signature block. A receptionist answered. I'm confirming receipt of the notice, I said. She transferred me. The attorney came on the line. Are you disputing the claim? He asked. Yes, I said. Were the funds pledged as a gift? They were paid under a venue contract, listing me as primary payer. Was there written confirmation that the funds were conditional? No. He paused. So, you're refusing voluntary reimbursement? I'm retaining my refund. He ended the call without further comment. The call lasted 3 minutes. At 8:37, my daughter texted, Did you get the letter? Yes. Can't you just send something to stop this? I paid once. At least talk to them. I did. She didn't reply. At 9:02, I opened the venue contract again. Section 3 listed payment terms. Section 8 listed cancellation rights. There was no mention of third-party claim. At 9:18, I highlighted those sections. At 9:25, I scanned the document into my computer. At 9:41, I searched my email for the word gift. It appeared nowhere in relation to the payment. At 10:04, I called my bank's customer service line. I need confirmation that refunded funds are legally unrestricted. I said. The representative placed me on hold. The hold music looped twice. At 10:12, she returned. The funds were processed as a contract refund to the original payer. There are no encumbrances. I wrote down her name and case ID. At 10:20, I added it to the correspondence folder. At 11:03, another email arrived from the attorney. Please provide documentation supporting your claim of contractual authority. I attached the signed venue agreement, the cancellation clause, the time-stamped confirmation email. At 11:17, I pressed send. At 11:24, he replied, reviewing. That was all. At 12:02 p.m., my daughter called. Brian's dad says you're escalating this. I responded to his lawyer. You didn't have to get technical. He did. She was quiet. At least meet them in person, she said. For what purpose? To clear the air. They sent a legal notice. That doesn't mean they want war. I don't either. The call ended at 12:14 p.m. At 1:05, I received a forwarded email from my daughter. Brian's father had written to extended family. We attempted private reconciliation. Funds were withdrawn without warning. The timestamp read 12:37 p.m. I read it once. At 1:12, I saved the email. At 1:20, I printed it. The paper curled slightly at the edges. At 2:03, another message from the attorney. We find no clause requiring reimbursement. However, we reserve the right to pursue civil claim under promissory estoppel. I looked up the term online. It required proof of reliance on a promise. At 2:11, I searched my email again for any promise language. There was none. At 2:19, I exported the entire planning spreadsheet history. It showed my payments logged. No written repayment expectation. At 3:04, my daughter texted. They say you promised this as a gift. I promised to attend. She didn't respond. At 3:22, I checked the time of her original message. 9:42 p.m. I printed it again. At 4:10, I received a voicemail from the attorney. We may advise our clients to discontinue further action. I didn't return the call immediately. At 4:32, my daughter called. Are they dropping it? I don't know. They're saying it's not worth pursuing. I see. But they think you ruined everything. I followed the contract. She exhaled sharply. You keep saying that. It's what happened. At 4:39, the call ended. At 5:05, I received a final email from the attorney. Our clients will not pursue litigation at this time. No apology. No further demand. At 5:18, I printed that email too. The folder felt heavier when I placed it inside. At 6:22 p.m., I sat at the kitchen table. The refrigerator hummed steadily. At 7:03, my daughter sent a message. They're saying we'll handle things ourselves from now on. That's good, I replied. She didn't answer. At 8:14, I removed the attorney's contact from my recent call log. At 9:02, I placed the folder back into the filing cabinet. I closed the drawer slowly. The following week, there were no calls from lawyers. At 8:12 a.m. Monday, my daughter sent a message. We're having a small dinner Sunday. Just Brian's family. I read it once. At 8:20, she added, we thought it might be less tense. I didn't reply. At 9:05, I noticed I was no longer included in the shared photo album link. The access page showed permission revoked. At 9:17, I closed the browser. At 10:02, Brian's mother posted new photos online. Caption, family support means everything. I read the comments. Several relatives wrote, so glad it stayed intimate. At 10:40, I muted her account. At 11:15, I opened my calendar. The original wedding date square was blank. I left it blank. At 12:03 p.m., my daughter called. We're keeping holidays small this year. I understand, I said. It's just easier. Okay. She paused. We'll let you know about Thanksgiving. The call ended at 12:11 p.m. At 1:30, I sorted the filing cabinet. The wedding void folder stayed in place. I added a new tab, legal notice. At 2:05, I received a group message from extended family. Brian's father wrote, we appreciate everyone respecting privacy during this transition. No one addressed me directly. At 2:14, I exited the thread. At 3:22, I removed myself from the family group chat. No one commented. At 4:10, my daughter sent a single text. You didn't have to leave the chat. I wasn't participating. That doesn't mean you're not family. I didn't respond. At 5:03, I received a holiday card draft by email. It listed Brian and my daughter's names. My name wasn't included. At 5:18, I archived the email. At 6:45, I reheated leftovers again. The microwave beeped twice. At 7:10, my daughter sent a photo of their new apartment. Caption, we're settling in. I typed, it looks nice. She replied, thanks. No follow-up. The next morning, at 8:02 a.m., I noticed my daughter had changed her last name online. At 8:07, I closed the app. At 9:18, I received a notification from my bank. Interest posted to savings. The balance looked stable. At 10:11, I opened the folder again. I flipped through the printed emails. The paper edges were slightly bent. At 11:26, I closed it and returned it to the drawer. At 1:05 p.m., my daughter texted, Brian's parents are hosting Christmas. I hope it goes well. I replied. They said space is limited. I understand. She didn't answer. At 3:40, I deleted the old wedding planning spreadsheet from my desktop. At 4:15, I emptied the trash folder. At 6:02 p.m., the house was quiet again. At 7:14, my daughter sent one last message that day. We're focusing on our future. I replied, that's good. No one mentioned the $45,000 again. No one mentioned the legal notice. The thread slowly stopped moving. The refrigerator kept humming. 3 months passed without any formal contact. At 8:03 a.m. on a Tuesday, my daughter sent a message. We're expecting. I read it while standing at the kitchen sink. The faucet was running. At 8:07, I turned it off and read the message again. No photo, no exclamation points. At 8:15, I replied, I hope you're healthy. She responded at 8:18. We are. At 9:02, I closed the message thread. Later that week, at 11:14 a.m., she sent an ultrasound image. No caption. I saved it to my phone. At 11:20, I wrote, Take care of yourself. She replied, we will. The conversation ended there. At 2:05 p.m., I opened the filing cabinet. The wedding void folder was still in the front. I moved it to the back. At 2:11, I closed the drawer. At 4:40, I received a calendar notification from work. Quarterly meeting scheduled. I accepted it. The following month, at 10:02 a.m., my daughter called. We're keeping the baby shower small. She said, I understand. It's mostly Brian's family. Okay. She hesitated. We'll send pictures. That's fine. The call ended at 10:07. At 12:18 p.m., I deleted the legal notice folder from my desktop. The printed copies remained in the drawer. At 3:30, I reorganized the kitchen cabinet. I stacked the unused printer paper neatly. At 5:14 p.m., I reheated dinner again. The microwave beeped once. At 7:08, my daughter sent a photo from the shower. Pink decorations, folding chairs, smiling faces. I typed, it looks nice. She replied, thanks. No invitation followed. Weeks later, at 6:45 a.m., she sent a message. The baby's here. I read it in bed. At 6:50, I replied, I'm glad you're safe. She sent one photo. The hospital blanket was white with small stripes. At 7:02, I saved the picture. I didn't ask about visiting. She didn't offer. At 8:30, I went to work. At 9:15, I sat in the quarterly meeting. The chair across from me remained empty. At 12:02 p.m., I received a routine email about benefits enrollment. I filled out the form. At 3:44, I walked past a mirror in the hallway at home. I looked the same. At 6:10 p.m., I placed the ultrasound image into a small envelope. I put it in the drawer beside the filing cabinet. The refrigerator hummed, as it always had. Life continued. That was enough.